Buenos dias. Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing? I am going to introduce myself, and then we're going to have a fireside conversation with Carly, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers from you guys, because we'd love to make this session as interactive as possible. So my name is Beatriz Acevedo. I am a very proud immigrant entrepreneur. I'm immigrant in a very strange way. My parents lived in San Diego when my mother was pregnant, and my father was a very proud Mexicano. And when my mother was in labor, my dad rushed her across the border, but to the opposite side, so I could be born in Mexico and one day have the privilege to serve my country as president. I never really questioned my dad of why he didn't think I could be president here, but all good that he had such high expectations of me when I was born. And back then, you know, there were no real ultrasounds or gender-revealing parties. I'm a child of the 60s, so when I was born, big shock, I was not a boy. And my dad thought, all right, she'll do, right? And, you know, we all know that we only need one person that really believes in us to make it in life. And that, for me, was certainly my father. There was nothing that I could think that I wanted to do that he didn't tell me, you can absolutely accomplish that. And I think as I've heard several of the conversations here around power and how do we take power and how do we sit at powerful tables and how do we make sure our voices are heard, I think that for me, something growing up was always this learning that the power was in me. And when I came to the US in my early 20s, I started my career in media when I was pretty young, when I was 8 years old. I have another story around that too. There was this boy band called Menudo. And I had a crush on Ricky Martin. And I had my plan and my life set out for me. So I was 8. And I thought that when Menudo came into my town, I'm going to meet Ricky. He's going to fall in love with me. I was already in love with him. We're going to get married. That did not work out for him or for me. And we were going to live happily ever after. So that's how I started my career in radio, actually. So I was a kid announcer. And I'd love to talk about this story because I had colleagues in radio who were also pretty young, maybe not 8, but that I met in my teenage years, who were incredibly talented. They would get a mic and they could speak for hours, they could improvise, they could do live TV, and I was always in awe of them because I certainly was not born with any talent when it came to communication. I was a very, very shy girl. To this day, I have a very high-pitched voice, not ideal for radio. But something that I learned early on is that passion can truly beat talent. And I say this a lot when I speak at universities. If you have talent, that is amazing. But you also need passion to really, you know, get to a place where you can fully work from that zone of genius that we should all aspire to be in. What is work that doesn't feel like work? What work would you do that you would do even if you didn't get paid? I mean, everybody should get paid for work. But just what is that? What is that purpose in life? What were you born to do? How do you use, you know, that power within you? And I've heard a lot the word empower today. And it's a word that I tend to use a lot. And there's a big Latina movement particularly who on stage, they've called me out and said, please don't empower us because we are already powerful and the power is in us. We only need the tools. We only need the opportunity. We only need somebody to believe in us to really reach our full potential. But the power, we already were born with it. So that's something that I want to offer that tends to be controversial, but I agree with. Also talking about, in the last panel, I heard about not shrinking and using your voice. And that is so important for our communities and for ourselves. I don't know if any of the Latinas in the room will resonate with this horrifying phrase that most of us grew up with from our moms and our abuelitas. Calladita te ves más bonita.
You look prettier
when you are
not
quiet,
speaking.
You look prettier. This is a phrase that was never said to our brothers. This is a phrase that was never said to the Latino men or boys. It was only to the women. Know your place. Stay in your lane. Smile and be quiet. That is what you are expected to do. I was a pretty rebellious girl, so that phrase never went well with me. And to this day, my mom is mortified. She's like, ay, mijita, calladita, te ves más bonita. But I think she's gotten used to it. But I think in all defense to our moms and to our abuelitas, when they came to this country, they wanted to be invisible. They wanted to keep their head down, work hard, not be noticed, not make any waves. And, you know, that is not this generation, thankfully. I see Gen Zs, my own kids, going into college. I have twins, actually. I see them rebel against anything that's not going to have them speak up or really be aligned to what their purpose and their mission is in their life, and I love that. I have so much hope in this younger generation, and I'm going to talk with Carly a little bit about that and my work that I do, trying to get economic empowerment to really the younger generations as a way to really penetrate our entire community. So anyway, let me see what else I wanted to tell you. Okay, one more thing, because I have just a few more minutes before we start a fireside chat. I also wanted to, offer up something else when we were talking about power and how this power is in us. Power means very different things to very different people, as we've heard. Sometimes we think that our power comes from our job title, or from the wealth we've created, or from the Ivy League school that we went to. I certainly did not go to any Ivy League school. But I do think that true power in our communities and in ourselves come from places that we rarely think about, which is our upbringing, things that we ate, things that we heard, the sayings from our moms and our grandmas. And that power is going to be more and more valuable in our everyday professional life. And I have a couple of examples to share with you just to illustrate this point that I think are super, super valuable. But when you look at how America is shaping up, when you look at the real new American majority, it is us. It is the people in this room. It is the people that were never invited to sit at those tables where power was distributed. But now we get to build our own power. As entrepreneurs, we know it's Latina and Black women launching more companies than anyone in this country, yet with the least amount of resources. I always say, imagine the possibilities if we were giving that chance. If we were giving those tools, if somebody would make that call to validate our startups, our ideas, it would be game-changing. But we're not waiting. We're still doing it, and we're still thriving. Look at the composition of the U.S. today with the workforce. It's 80% of the new workforce is going to be led by new Latinos entering the workforce. So the insights that our communities of color have are going to be critical, not just in the growth of companies, but in the survival of companies. So we are in a really incredible place, but it has to start with us. It needs to start with us not feeling small like we heard in the previous panel. We need to find that power that is already in us and think, because we are different, because we are the other in the room, that gives us our power. Our insights are going to be incredibly powerful. Anybody here saw the Hot Cheetos, Flaming Hot Cheetos movie? Before the movie came out, I used to talk a lot about Richard Montañez, and nobody knew who he was, but now, obviously, a lot of people know. But you guys know he was a janitor who did not finish high school, and he was the inventor of Flaming Hot Cheetos. That is the biggest selling product for PepsiCo to date, right? So one insight that he had was that in our communities, people put chili into everything, right? Like into our papitas, into our fries, into our elotes, into our corns. And there was an insight that he brought into a company and made $1 billion opportunity from an insight that didn't come from Harvard, didn't come from any fancy university. It came from how he grew up with. Same thing with Magic Johnson. I had an opportunity to sit with him at a panel, and he actually was an investor in my previous company right after the panel. And Magic Johnson was talking about how when he bought the franchises in LA, in South LA, in Compton, in East LA, for Starbucks, he refused to sell scones. And that was a, big deal. They're like, why would you not want to sell scones? This is another insight, right? Magic is like, there is no way my people are gonna eat that dry piece of bread. So I'm gonna sell sweet potato pies. And the sweet potato pies sold incredibly well. So Magic Johnson didn't have that insight from being a superstar basketball player, for being so rich, for being so... That was an insight of something he knew. This will never work. So I am so excited to see that our insights that come just from us, from being different, our difference is going to be our superpower. And I'm excited that we all get to tap into that and really share it with the world. I'm going to now take a few questions sitting down and then hopefully some questions from you guys, because I think I already exceeded my time here introducing myself. Thank you. Okay, Carly. I saved a lot of my stories for you.
I'm excited to hear. Thank you so much for sharing. We're going to do some live stage management while we're on stage. Thank you so much, Sharon, for your story, the journeys around power and passion, and really what brings you to the conversation today. We are excited to share with everyone some more of these stories of how you've interacted with the world, how you've moved through the spaces, how you've navigated when you're the only voice or a limited voice in space. So thank you for highlighting many of those as we come in through. We know in many of the spaces where we're trying to make change, the norm is white dominant culture. It might be a little more pale and a little more stale and a little more male than we find in our own communities and cultures. So how have you, and can you share an example or two of how you have shined through those opportunities, how your voice, your community, your experience has allowed you to shift and make change?
Yeah, I mean, everything, as you can now imagine after my introduction, I lean very hard into my Latinidad. I absolutely bring my entire self to work and to anything that I do. From the way I passionately move my hands, to the way I dress, to my jewelry, like I am all in. And nothing makes me more excited than to walk into a room where nobody looks like me. And I think this is just that I was ignorant when I started. When I moved to the US, I didn't know the data. I didn't know the stats that only 0.02% of women of color would get funding. So I didn't go in thinking, oh my gosh, this is gonna be really hard. Oh my God, I'm probably gonna get every single time a no. I didn't know. So in a naive way, when I would walk into these rooms of venture capital, and mind you, I had never raised venture capital in my life, and I would see that every single guy looked identical. I mean, literally, like the same suit, the same pants, the same shoes. It was kind of eerie. And then I walked in with all my passion and color and enthusiasm. I would feel so powerful because I would be like, great, no one here is like me. Nobody has my insights. Nobody has my point of view. For sure, they're gonna give me their money. And they did, which is crazy, right? But I always say, you gotta walk into those rooms with white man swagger, but not really, with your own swagger from your own community. But I think we're taught, now that I do read those Harvard Business Review articles that say you're not going to get a promotion if you overly use your hands, or if your voice is too loud, or if you wear some embroidered dresses. All I own is embroidered dresses, by the way. My husband's like, you already own that dress. I'm like, no, it's in a different color. But, and I don't want to say others have not had that experience of saying, oh, wow, right? The hoops, the red lipstick, the Latinidad has not helped me. In my experience, I push it to the limit, right? But I make sure that I couple it with the data. I always know the data, right? And so it's not a scare tactic, but it's definitely something that I open all the time, right? Do you know that wherever I am, home ownership is led by our communities, the increase in, college enrollment, workforce, that GDP would be at a negative number if it wasn't for our communities driving that GDP growth. All these stats of where you'd be nowhere without us, and you'll be nowhere in the future if you don't start now. So I think it's that, right? The confidence that I have that we are so critical and important for this economy, and coupled with the data that I want to make sure that everybody who looks the same, that has thought that diversity is charity, fully understands that diversity is the most incredible ROI for their companies.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder, there are note cards on your table. If you do have a question that comes up, please write them on the note cards. We do have runners in the aisles that will come grab them. And so you have about 10 minutes to put together a few questions before we turn
my answers shorter.
No,
sorry.
we're good. You spoke about being one of the first in the room. When you are the first in the room, how do you keep the door open for other folks to come in?
Yeah, so, obviously I'm incredibly aware of my privilege. From the color of my skin to the first time I had a job when I said that I was 8 and in love with Ricky Martin, my father made a phone call to the owner of the radio station. And I say it all the time, right? People say, well, how did you get started? I'm like, oh, well, my dad, oh, there you are. There's your privilege. I'm like, 100%, right? I work hard. But I always felt very guilty with that privilege. From the color of my skin to my father making that first phone call. When I moved to the US, he certainly knew nobody here. He's an attorney and didn't even understand what I did in digital media, and certainly less in fintech. So I think out of that, I wanted to make sure that if I had that opportunity given to me, and if I had those doors open for me in any way, I would open more doors for my community. And I've never had a scarcity mentality, because I think that's another sort of point that we need to address in our communities. There's never been an abundance for us, right? In anything that we've done. So I understand when people say, particularly older Latinas like me, there's so few that get funding, there's so few that sit on public boards, there's so few that, the stats. And sometimes I talk to some of them and they're like, well, listen, nobody helped me. And I'm like, but who cares? You need to open those doors for the next generation. You're not going to live forever. And even if you're thinking somebody younger is going to take up my space and my chair, that's your time to give it up. But that is, not everyone thinks that way. For me personally, the more I want to share in my power, the more opportunities I'm given. And I just think that's just how the universe works. I don't do it for the universe to give me more by any means, but I'm very intentional in what I do. For example, and I'll give some examples here. If somebody asks me to speak at a conference and I see no other women, no other people of color, no other Latino, I already have an Excel spreadsheet ready from every area possible that I recommend so they can be invited to these conferences, because I am not going to be the token person because, oh, she'll check all the boxes, right? The immigrant, the Latina, the older, the everything, and then she's funny. No. So I always want to make sure that that is spread. Many times, even on my boards, there's very few Latinas on public boards. I always ask for somebody to be able to come as an observer from my community. The first board that I had, I was mortified. I had no idea what to do, and I don't want anybody to have that perception. +1 in important rooms. I love my husband, but he's not my +1. It's going to be somebody that can benefit from those introductions, from me walking them into the room, sitting them in the powerful tables, and introducing them to people that can be transformational to them. So I think we all have something to give, right? My dad would always say that. We all have something to give, no matter at what level we are. But we need to be intentional, that we are not just sort of excited that we get the opportunity for ourselves. You'll continue to have those opportunities, but it's important to make sure that we are setting up the next generation to succeed.
Awesome, thank you. That opportunity to share power and organize is really important, I think, in the work that we're doing now. When we look back at the work that you have done and currently done, whether it was Me Too or Sue My Wealth or LA Collab, how do you think about really strategies around building collective power?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer, as everyone I'm sure in this room, that collective power is where it's at, and that 1 + 1 is certainly more than 2. So in everything that I've always done, I want to make sure that I always lead with community. Even in my most recent startup, which sounds very crazy, when I told investors, there's no product. My product is my community. I mean, some scratched their heads and some totally got it, right? But it is very important that we start with community, and that we listen to our community. Also being arrogant and thinking, I know better because I am a Latina, so I know what, I have 2 Gen Z twins, I know what Gen Z kids need to pay off college debt. That's not true. The data told us that all they want is to retire early, even if they haven't started working. I'm like, you're 18, how do you want to retire? But good for them. But for me, it's always about, like, how do we build community, how do we build trust, and how do we really, really listen into the needs of the community before we think that we have the answers and the solutions to fix our problems. I think that's just incredibly arrogant. So I try to do that, whether it's media or now fintech with Suma, to always be very mindful of, be driven, anything I build that's driven by the community, and that I'm always have a very close ear on what are the true needs, and let that inform my roadmap of anything that I'm going to do.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we have some great questions from our community here today. A couple pieces of how you think about the space when you hold new table space, or you are inviting your +1s in those spaces. Questions around if folks are in those scenarios where they're the first or they're one of the few. What are your thoughts when there feels that there's challenge to someone's identity and authenticity around being not Latino or Latinx enough for what folks are looking for, or that there's a sense of Latino tokenism for engaging folks? How has that shown up for you, or how have you challenged that?
I'm going to go first with being Latine or Latinx or Latino, Latina enough, because that's a really big one. Especially in my previous company at Me Too, you know, I'm an immigrant. And I loved the previous panel when they're like, and you can speak in your language of love. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I could do it in Spanish. Anyway, but Spanish is certainly, as you can tell, my first language. And, you know, when I had Me Too, it was mostly, you know, young millennials at the time, about a decade ago. And I would torture them in the kitchen, like, you know, asking them how their weekend was in Spanish. I'm like, ¿Cómo te fue el fin de semana? Good. Y ¿estás emocionado de este nuevo proyecto? Yes. And I was like, oh my gosh, I feel totally like their abuelitas or their moms, just like annoying them tremendously. And in response, I think to me, they pitched a story that they wanted to do about them being fully Latino, Latina, Latinx, and not speaking Spanish, right? So, and they're like, we are incredibly proud of everything in our culture, but we don't speak Spanish. And that does not make us less Latino, right? And so that was a big learning moment for me, and I think that from from that day on, I've been very mindful to be very, very careful that anything that I build is not in language, but in culture, right? So yes, their grandmothers or their moms or me might prefer something in Spanish, but to them it's very, very important that we are culturally relevant, but still acknowledge that they are very proud of their community. I don't know if people saw that kid at this soccer game last week, and these broadcasters are like speaking to the poor kid in Spanish, and the kid has everything from the Mexican soccer team, and he's struggling, like he doesn't understand the questions, and people are just like, oh, how can he not be Mexican if he doesn't speak Spanish? I'm like, the kid doesn't speak Spanish, and he is so happy to be there with the culture, with the people, with his soccer jersey, but let him be, right? And I think there's a lot of that I want to offer up to the room, where people think about serving our communities. It definitely goes to the default of Spanish. Not that there is not a big number of Spanish speakers in our country, but 80% of the under 34 are English dominant. Okay, so the growth, as you know, is coming from nativity, from US born, and not from immigration. At least within the Latino community, the majority are US born. So it's very important that in everything that we do, every resource that we offer to them is in culture more than in language. And I think they never get that. They never feel like they belong. It's in Spanish for my older family members, or it's in English where I'm not represented. So that's a big insight that we've learned.
Great, and thank you. I think there feels like there's a really direct tie to indigenous communities as well. So many of us have lost or extinct languages, but the culture, the connection, the community are really what it is to be of that community, of that identity in that space. Building on that, what is your advice for young women of color who get into leadership roles, but realize how difficult and lonely it can be in those roles?
I mean, listen, I think that I haven't been sort of in the corporate setting since I got fired in my early 20s. I forgot to talk about that in my intro. And I'm glad my mom is not in this room, because she's always like, ay, mijita, you weren't fired, you quit. I'm like, not really, Mom. Anyway, I mean, I got a thing saying you're canceled, we'll pay you, but you're never gonna be on the air again. So I'm like, kind of fired. So, from that, and that was in my early 20s, and I became an entrepreneur by necessity. Again, no, we talked about how it's Black and Latina women launching more companies. Not all of them by choice. Many of them, like me, by necessity. You can't find a job. You're very lonely at a corporate job. It's not what you thought about, and you're like, I'm going to launch my own company without any help, without any resources, without any capital, and yet we're hustling and doing it well, which is amazing. So I would say, listen, I don't know the size of the organization of who asked this question. I see more and more that there's, and I don't know if they're effective or not, groups that tend to be sort of like, okay, is this a women of color group that has the support? Is this a, something that makes you feel in community? And if it's not in your same job, there are groups out there that you can really turn into your own communities to really share how you are. I have so many WhatsApp groups. That tells you I'm a Mexican and an immigrant. It's not a chat, it's a WhatsApp group. And I have so many in my bag of like Latinas racing seat rounds, Latina moms with kids going to college, Latinas, you make your own, and you sort of like, it might not be perfect with technology or anything, but you find that comfort in your people, for sure. It is lonely when you are the first and only one. I'm not gonna lie. You look around and you're like, but that's also fuel and motivation for you to think, okay, I'm the first but not the last, and how do I bring more people from my community here, and how do I open more doors? And you sort of make that something that drives you every day, right? But in whatever organization you work for, you need to make sure that there's a path for you to grow, that people value your contributions. Use that data to scare them and tell them that without you, there'll be no growth. They're going to get no big bonuses without your insights. But that's also a choice. Sometimes people say, you know, yeah, so-and-so didn't work out. I'm like, well, it's not necessarily is the fault of a flower. It's sort of like the soil that doesn't let it bloom, right? So you have to be mindful of what is that organization that you're in. Is it really, you know, fueling your purpose, your mission, making you feel like, because we spend so much time at work, so we really need to make sure, and obviously, again, it's privileged to say, I'm not going to work here because it's not in my mission. I love Gen Zs who do that, but they don't really work. But you have to be obviously responsible, but look for paths of where like, this is not gonna be for me. It might be uncomfortable to go to in a different place, plan it. My dad would always say like, don't let go of one rope before you're grabbing onto the next one like Tarzan. And that's great, unless you're fired like me. I had to swim or sink. But I think that's a good conversation, you know, not be miserable in your job, make sure that you are fulfilled and you're passionate and you're making the contributions that you want to be making. I mean, that's super important.
As we think about being in those rooms and changing those rooms, another question of advice came up is like, what advice would you give a white ally that really wants to shift the space? Create an opportunity that's different. What would you tell them or encourage them to do?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of, and I find it very useful. I do a lot of, there used to be free, but now I'm like, make a donation to my nonprofit so I can give it back to the community. But I do a lot of just presentations in general, not that you need to do the same, but I try to get in those rooms where people are really making those decisions that nobody looks like me, those CEOs of Fortune 100 companies. And again, I really use the data. And I'm like, listen, you are here. You could be here if you included us. You could be growing at this rate instead of this rate. Sometimes the data is there, but they don't apply it to where they are. So I would say for any ally of any color, just for them to understand, you know, what an incredible asset you are and what a critical part our communities are going to play in just keeping America growing and successful and thriving and as a leader in the world. And if they don't do that, it's going to be a huge miss, not just for us, but for everybody else. So I think just really, in a nice and loving way, expressing that to them, I think is a really good way to start, right? As far as like, you know, things that people do or say that are like crazy. There was this lady, this is a crazy story, but this is a story in my kids' school when they were in elementary school, and there are all these moms who were not diverse trying to set up a table for the teacher's luncheon. And then when I showed up, they're like, oh my God, thank God you're here, B. You're Mexican. You know how to set the table. I was like, oh, and you know what? I know how to set an amazing table. And I take a lot of pride in that. But you know, you kind of have to lovingly later be like, well, you know what? Like that might have come up in a different way. If that is what you mean when like how you show up. But as far as like supporting because it's good for everyone, that is a different conversation. That data always is very helpful.
Speaking of data, we know that we are at a growth point on this in our country. We are at a shifting to a more diverse nation, more diverse communities. In many states, in many places, we are already at those tipping points in the majority base. And when those awareness of those shifts in power are coming up, when we're getting more folks of color at the table, brown, black, BIPOC folks in space, and Latinx folks in community together, there can be a feeling, a challenge to your scarcity comment earlier, of pitting our communities against each other. So how do we work collectively better together in solidarity and work towards our own collective liberation?
Oh my God, that's a great question that I don't know that I'm the perfect person to answer. But obviously, when we talked about collective power, it includes everybody that has not historically had that power. And how do we, you know, use each other's strengths into really being able to collectively take what we deserve? On the opposite side, on your point of like, oh, on the ally side, I would say, where they're feeling a little bit like, oh no, like this is the last, moment for me. There's something that we do in LA. LA obviously is a majority of color city. There's like the 10 million people that live there. Half of them are Latino, Latinx. Then it's white, 5 million are Latinos, 3 million are white, 1.5 million, I believe, Asian, and then I think around 1 million black. But so if you add us all minus the 3 million black people, it's 7 million out of the 10. So certainly a majority city. Yet when you look at who has the power, and here I'm going to talk about economic power, we certainly don't have it. It's the minority of the city who has all the economic power. And the way that we've been able to sort of, reach out to them and say, listen, are you willing to sign a pledge? And this is how we launched Pledge LA, which was a private-public collaboration. It was all the venture capitalists, all the tech companies, and then the city of LA really pledging to be intentional on how they're funding the LA ecosystem. And it was easy with the venture capitalists because they're so competitive. We're like, you could be better than Silicon Valley, and they all signed. But the reality is, we still heard we can't find the talented entrepreneurs. We can't find the women to work in venture. We can't find, so we decided to find them for them. So we've done a lot of work in LA to literally we'll pay the internships of the brilliant kids of color to come into venture. We will, host the entrepreneurs and give them stipends and prepare them before they need to pitch a venture capitalist. There's a lot of work and a lot of intentionality that needs to be done for us to be able to get to some sort of, equality. I mean, we're not there yet, but we started at 0.02% about 4 years ago. So out of the $15 billion being distributed in venture capital in LA, we got nothing. Now combined, Black, Latino, Asian, we're at about 13%. We're not at 70, but 0.02 to 13, when it's billions of dollars, it's transformative in our communities. So I think that it needs to be, and if you talk to these people now, they love the companies they funded. They love the new people that they've hired in their venture firms. That some of these venture firms didn't even have a woman in the entire company, not even a receptionist. I'm like, you don't even think we can answer a phone? It's ridiculous. Of course, less a CFO or a partner or anything. Now there's a change, right? But I think that it's taken us time, resources to really be able to put it there. Should it be on us? Of course not. Should we just say, okay, we're going to wait to see if they can discover us and discover the brilliance in our communities? No, that's not the answer either. So I think, a mix has helped us as far as in the LA tech ecosystem.
Thank you. On that point, I think there's so much work that happens around finding shining stars when we know that our communities are constellations of magic. Yeah. And you spoke to it a minute ago. What's the work, and one of the questions came through, what's the work that CEOs, leadership, nonprofit leaders can do to support employees as they become more diverse, as they try to become more inclusive, to ensure access to resources, mentorship, financial support along their journeys? Yeah,
to your point, talents equal, opportunities not. That's just the reality. So again, you have to be intentional. If people in our community, and we know, we're not in their circle, right? We're not, I'm on some boards where I'm like, hey, are you, those 2 positions that are the C-suite, are you gonna hire a Black or Latina women? Because you just have us at the bottom of your employees. And they're like, oh, well, I'm like, who are the candidates? Are they white? And not to say white candidates are not talented, but I'm like, are we getting a chance here? Are you, but they don't know them. They don't know us. So you have to be so intentional in saying, at least reach out to people where, so CEOs need to be smart to be who do I need to ask? Who do I need to talk to? Where can I find these people that are not in my network and that I'm missing out on this great talent? There's one example that I have, and this is an internship, so it's not like the C-suite, but this C-suite, we are definitely putting a lot of pressure that that gets done. And this is one CEO of a very popular social media company. I'm not going to mention because you'll know who it is. And I was like, listen, dude, like, give me some internships for community college kids. And because as you know, community college kids talking about talent and lack of opportunity, they're not at the top of the recruiter's list. They're not getting the amazing internships. And it's our kids in our communities. So I was like, can you please, he's like, we're so good with the kids with the internships. I have a black kid from Harvard. I have a Latino kid from Stanford. I'm like, stop, dude, you have the same kid. Like, you can't tell me that that is not the same kid. And not to say that those kids don't come from, you know, low-income families and they fought hard, but they're in a path, okay? Like, Harvard is going to find them an internship. Stanford is going to find them an internship. How about the kid from East LA College? Like, what is the path for that kid? What is the path for a kid that was previously incarcerated for stealing a stupid pack of gum? What is the path for a kid who comes from a foster home? Like, there's no path for them. So this CEO, I was just like, I nagged him so much that he was like, I'm going to give you one kid from a community. I'm like, oh my God, you're so generous. But he gave it to me. Next board meeting that I see him, he's like, oh my God, like, we now have 3 more kids from community. They're the best. Like, they represent who we're targeting. They work harder than anybody. We should not be working harder than anybody because we are of color, by the way. But anyway, his assessment was they work harder than anybody. They're so grateful for the opportunity. There's also, like, you were right. It's not the same type of kid, right? And so I think that CEOs need to be mindful that not because you're a Latino or you're black or you're a woman, then that's it. That's it. The perspectives of how you grew up, like what I said earlier, where you come from, whether you're an immigrant, whether you're a dreamer, whether you go to an Ivy League school, that's all good. You want that diversity for good, positive outcomes in your company as good ROI. Again, never charity, but good ROI. So I think that's what we need to do.
Thank you. That speaks to a few questions that came up about intersectionality of how people hold space in the workforce, whether they're Gen X, whether Latinx, and LGBTQ, and come from a rural community, come from East Colfax Corridor. No matter where they come from and what they bring, that those are important layers of what they bring to the work.
They're super valuable. Like, I really never want the same type of employee from the same school, from the same background, even if they're all from my community. I want that diversity, and and you see it in their contributions, right? And those are the communities you're also serving. So there's so many things that you miss. I didn't talk about imposter syndrome, but that's pretty common with, I know for sure Latina women, and I'm sure there's other women. And it happens to me to this point, right? Sitting on these crazy boards with like all celebrities that don't need it. Nobody needs an introduction but me. They're like, who's that lady that's like always raises her hand? And I'm always very nervous before a board meeting thinking, oh my God, like, am I gonna have something to say? Like, what am I gonna contribute? Like, here's the CEO of Nike, and here's the CEO of this, and here's this Olympic athlete, and I always have something to offer, right? As nervous that I am, they missed something, right? In something that happened, and like, how are we gonna allocate the resources to all these kids from public schools? Well, and I'm like, whoa. You're not giving the same money to like Beverly Hills High than East LA, are you? And they're like, oh, we didn't think about it, right? So there's always something in that intersectionality from wherever you were, from whatever you did, there's something that someone else who is in that sea of sameness is gonna miss. So that's where I'm like, especially for the women in the room, say yes, I can do it, because we always feel like, oh, I need a little more preparation. I mean, it happens to me. But you know more than you think you do. You know more than we give ourselves credit for, especially in this new America. So I want to see all of you guys in those top roles, making those contributions that sometimes we are the ones that self-select out. So we need to be intentional and just breathe through it and do it. White man swagger.
I think a piece that stands out, and there's an advisory group that I've just joined, and I looked at the list and I met everyone, and I was like, I think everyone's done a cameo on MSNBC except for me. And I'm like, one of these things does not belong. But similarly, it's a unique voice, it's a unique perspective. I would also share, and there was a couple questions that came through, of if you aren't as comfortable on stage with a mic, about the ability to be yourself in those roles, ability no matter where and how you use your voice, but the ability and power to use your voice. And it can, what is the quote? Even if your voice trembles, that it's important.
I mean, listen, it's a muscle, right? And I shared with you guys, I was very shy. I'd be mortified if anybody handed me a mic. But I wanted to do it. I really wanted to marry Ricky Martin and be on radio. So every day after school, I would go home, and for hours, I would practice in front of a mirror. Like, acabamos de escuchar al grupo Menudo y súbete a mi moto cuando son las 4 de la tarde con 20 minutos. But I wouldn't say it like that. I would be like shaking and sweating, and I really wanted it. I had the passion, and I had to like couple it with my hustle, and I wanted to do it. And even public speaking, even getting on a stage before. It used to be like, oh my God, like my stomach hurts, my this. It doesn't hurt today. But the more you do it, if you want to do it, because there's, my mom's incredibly brilliant, and she gives lectures everywhere, and she's just like, do not put me on a stage, do not give me a keynote, ask me some questions, and that's also okay. But if you want to do it, you can do it. I mean, it's literally the same as learning any other task, being on stage, telling your story, being authentic to who you are. But if you don't want to do it, you can also say no. But definitely use your voice. No more calladitas, no more. That for sure, okay? I know I'm defying my abuelita and my mom. Every time I'm like, excuse me, raise my hand. But it doesn't serve us today. In this generation, it doesn't serve us. The generation of our daughters or our nieces or sobrinitas, it doesn't serve us. We have to eradicate this whole thing of keep your head down, and don't make any waves, and be grateful. It's amazing to be grateful, but we absolutely need to ask for what we deserve.
Thank you.
38 seconds.
Final question. What does building a culture, a comunidad, taste and sound like to you?
Oh my God, I'm all about culture and comunidad in everything that I do. I mean, I think for me it's just, learning from everybody, supporting people that are like-minded, being able to do a lot of peer-to-peer mentorship, open as many doors as we can for each other. I think community is absolutely everything, and being mindful of how you're showing up in those communities and how many doors. For me, I want my legacy to be as many doors as I was able to open for people in my community. So community is at top of my mind and everything to me.
Thank you. Join me in thanking Beatriz. We are at a lunch now. It is almost lunch, but before we go, just a few reminders. We'll have lunch until 1:30, and then at 1:30, we'll start our next round of exchange sessions. Those will run their period time, and then at 3:15, we have some amazing opportunities, as we mentioned earlier. You can join a conversation with Juana Borges and about her new book and learn about engaging deeper in conversations and supporting Latino leadership within your organizations and Latinx communities. We also have a yoga opportunity again today, and a joyful creative writing sharing and community exercise. So find the time and find the space to connect in those places. Take some time for yourself as well, because we will see you tonight back for the reception and dance party.